Hello guys, how's it going? I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to my true crime channel where I go into all the details of a true crime case whilst I do my makeup. First of all, I am so sorry that there have not been so many new videos recently. If you follow me on Instagram, you will know that I recently went away to Rome. I did actually vlog that. The vlog is up on my personal channel. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link in the description. But everything has just been so hectic recently, so I'm sorry I haven't had time to sit down and film a video. But here I am for this one. Just before we do get into the video, I feel I should give a quick content warning that we are going to be discussing some pretty dark topics in today's video, such as the kidnap, murder and assault of a young child, as well as paedophilia and attempted suicide, as well as many other just generally unsettling topics. So if you are at all unsure about this video or feel it might affect you in any way whatsoever, please do feel free to click off this video and go and watch something else. I'd also like to give a disclaimer that all the information I've compiled in this video has been sourced from the internet, news reports and family statements, and although it is never my intention to spread misinformation or cause offence to anybody involved, please do let me know down below if you see any false information. So with that, let's get right into the case. So today's video is actually another requested case. I got lots of people asking me to cover this case over on my Instagram, and I'm not really massively surprised because this case is one of the most well-known famous cases in the UK. I'm sure most of you will have already heard of this case if you're from the UK, even if you don't know all the specific details, but that is what we're going to be going into today. So this video is going to be covering the kidnap, assault and murder of 2-year-old James Bulger. James was born on the 16th of March 1990 in Liverpool, England. On the 12th of February 1993, when James was 2.5 years old, his mother took him on a day trip to the Strand shopping centre in Bootle, which is in Liverpool. They spent a few hours walking around the different shops in the shopping centre, and then at around 3:30 p.m. they went to A.R. Tim's, which was the butcher's shop. Meanwhile, two 10-year-old boys, Robert Thompson and John Venables, had decided to bunk off school and go to the Strand shopping centre. These two boys were kind of known for being kind of bad news. They were often very badly behaved. They often bunked off school. This was completely not unusual for them to be skipping school. And on this particular day, they decided that they wanted to go to the Strand shopping centre and steal some items. They ended up stealing paint, batteries and toys from different stores, which I know sounds like a very random selection of things, but these are important for later on in the case. But anyway, after a while of sort of shoplifting and committing petty theft, they decided that they wanted to do something a bit more exciting. And between the two of them, they decided to kidnap a child. I don't quite know how you go from petty theft to full-on taking a small child, but the way that these two boys were, they were basically constantly egging each other on, seeing how far they could kind of push the limits before getting in trouble, and I'm guessing that this was just the next step for them. As I say, these boys were literally just egging each other on. Like, neither one of these two boys is worse than the other. They literally just wanted to kind of impress each other by seeing who could be the most badly behaved. So James and Denise were both in the butcher's at this time. As I say, it was around 3:30 p.m. And as Denise went to go and pay for her purchases, she very briefly let go of James's hand. And in the brief few minutes that it took her to pay for her items and glance back to where she had last seen James, he was gone. James had actually ended up wandering away towards the entrance of the shop, and little did Denise know that this was the last time she would ever see her son. It's the kind of thing that could literally happen to anybody, and that's why it's so scary. Like, it's not even like she took her eyes off him for 5 minutes and left him on his own. She literally just let go of his hand for a few seconds, and that's all it took. And I guess at least Denise has some peace of mind that she did absolutely everything she could when she realised that James was gone. But either way, it's just every parent's nightmare. So this is where the two stories kind of come together. Robert and John had spotted James standing at the entrance of the butcher's and they had called him over to them. Now the thing is, James was literally 2 years old at the time of this case. Like, he wasn't even old enough to have been taught or to even understand the idea of don't talk to strangers or don't leave your mum. He literally just wanted to do as he was told. So James walked over to the boys and all three of them left the Strand shopping centre hand in hand. And to anybody who was, shopping in the Strand or walking through the Strand, it would have looked like the most normal thing ever. Two young boys holding possibly their younger brother's hand, taking care of him, looking after him. Nothing would have looked amiss in the slightest. So the three boys walked out of the shopping centre and towards a nearby canal. And this is where the case starts to take a bit of a darker turn. So we know that John and Robert are both desperate to impress the other, and at this point they start joking around about pushing James into the canal. John and Robert walked James over to the edge of the canal and tried to get him to kind of look down into it or kneel down so that he could get into a position where they could push him in. But James was obviously very scared at this point and very confused and really didn't want to do it. And this is when the boys start to get really frustrated with James, and Robert actually ends up picking up James and throwing him to the ground, causing him to smash his head against the stone pathway. And after Robert had done this, he literally just picked James up and put his hood up so that nobody walking past could see his injuries, and the two boys just laughed. They walked along the canal for about 2.5 miles, and in that time, 38 witnesses said that they saw James being kicked, taunted, bullied, and just generally sort of shoved around by the boys. It would literally be so easy in this situation to just assume that these were two boys with their younger brother who was throwing a tantrum and they were just trying to sort of calm him down. Luckily, a few people did actually stop them, however, and sort of ask them what was going on, but the boys just flat out lied. They made up different stories to tell every person that they ran into. They told them that James was their younger brother, who they were taking home. They told someone else that they'd found James wandering on his own and they were taking him to the police station. They literally just made up whatever they could to get away with it, and it worked. So the boys continued to walk along the canal until they reached some railway tracks which were near both Robert and John's houses, and here is where things go from bad to absolutely unimaginable. So remember I said that John and Robert had bought paint from the Strand shopping centre. What they decided to do next was to stand James on the train tracks and throw blue paint at him, and this went all over his body, all over his face. It would have gone in his eyes, in his mouth, and they didn't leave it there. Once they'd run out of paint, they started picking up bricks and rocks that were lying around on the train tracks and throwing these at James. 2.5-year-old James Bulger suffered 42 injuries from the boys and was also hit over the head with an iron bar, which is believed to be the thing that ultimately killed him. I am just going to give another disclaimer at this point because the next few details of this case are just so horrific. But James's clothes were actually removed from the waist down, and although it hasn't been proven, it's believed that he was also sexually assaulted by these two 10-year-old boys. So once John and Robert had had their fun with James, they placed his body over the railway tracks and covered it with stones and rocks and bricks in an attempt to make it look like an accident. Meanwhile, James's parents spent the whole night searching for James, and the police put out a statement to the public which asked anybody who might have any information to come forward. All the witnesses who I mentioned before who had seen the boys walking along the canal earlier that day gradually came forwards, including a woman who was just in floods of tears. She had seen these boys walking along the canal, she'd had a terrible feeling, and she just hadn't done anything about it. Since the last place that James had been seen by his mother was the Strand shopping centre, the police obviously decided to check the CCTV. And in plain view was James Bulger walking out of the Strand shopping centre hand in hand with two boys. And one just really sad part of this case is that the police's initial reaction to seeing James leaving the Strand with two boys was relief. They thought if James was with two young boys who were holding his hand, what harm could possibly come to him? From the security footage, it was actually quite hard to tell the exact ages of the boys, but the police assumed that they were young teenagers. However, a security guard who was living in Bootle near the Strand decided after seeing the news to check his security cameras just in case they had picked up anything. And sure enough, the cameras caught the three boys walking alongside a wall near the security guard's house. And when the security guard called the police were able to stand next to the wall and basically compare the footage to them being stood next to it, and were able to see that the boys were actually a lot smaller and younger than they initially thought that they were. The police decided that the boys probably weren't even teenagers yet, they were just young boys, and this gave them even more hope that James would be found safe and well. However, this hope did start to fizzle out over the next few days as the news of James's disappearance spread throughout Liverpool, but still no sign of James was found. The police were still completely lost on what could have possibly happened to James after he'd left the Strand shopping centre, but they were growing less and less sure by the day that he would be found alive. And sure enough, a few days later, four boys were playing on the train tracks and they discovered the severed body of 2-year-old James Bulger. This news absolutely shook the entire community. The fact that a young boy could just wander out of a shopping centre hand in hand with two boys and then show up dead on some train tracks. So once the police had got over the initial shock of the news, it was time to figure out what had happened. And there were a lot of small tip-offs that helped them figure out who the culprits were. The first bit of information which helped the police figure out who was responsible came from a taxi driver who had been sat in his taxi outside the Strand shopping centre at the time that James was taken. And the driver had seen the two boys coming out of the shopping centre hand in hand with James. And one thing that he distinctly remembered was that James really didn't want to leave. The driver, just like everybody else, assumed that these were just three brothers, and when James refused to walk on his own, one of the older boys ended up picking him up by his arm and sort of carrying him across his body and away from the Strand. The next thing that the police figured out was that given the boys had walked pretty much 2 miles down this canal and then dumped James's body on the train tracks, they most likely knew the area and lived nearby, and so the police assumed that they were most likely hiding in their houses nearby the crime scene. One of the biggest breakthroughs in this investigation, however, came on the 17th of February when a woman came into the police station and said that she knew that one of her neighbour's sons had been skipping school, and she knew for a fact that he had skipped school on the day that James had gone missing. She also knew that this neighbour's son had gone with one of his friends, and the names that she gave to the police were John and Robert. So on the next day, the 18th of February, the police went to 10-year-old Robert Thompson's house and flat out asked him if he had killed James Bulger. And Robert reacted in pretty much the way you would expect a 10-year-old boy to react, and he just burst into tears. He completely denied having anything to do with what had happened and ended up being pretty much inconsolable. Robert was actually the 5th son in a family of 7 boys, and although Robert himself wasn't at this point known to police, all of his brothers were on police records. The police then visited John Venables at his house where he lived with his mother, which was just 2 miles away from the crime scene. The two boys were taken to separate police stations so they would have absolutely no contact with each other, and the investigations were carried out. Watching these two interviews, it's really interesting to see the two kind of personalities of John and Robert. Throughout both of their interviews, they consistently blamed the other person. The thing that just completely baffled the police about this case was trying to figure out what had caused these two 10-year-old boys to do such an awful thing. Neither of them had been involved with the police before, and neither of them knew James either before they decided to kidnap him, so it wasn't even like they had some kind of vendetta against him. One of the main things that gave the police an idea that something was seriously wrong with these boys before they had done what they did was that Robert's father was known to be a very violent drunk who had left Robert when he was younger, and following his father leaving, his mother had actually attempted suicide. It was also said that Robert's brothers were actually all scared of each other and used to tie each other up and bully each other. And so it was pretty clear that Robert, in particular, had not had an easy upbringing. As well as that, one of John's previous school teachers had said that he was violent, he often used to attack other children, and just generally behaved very strangely. The two boys were ultimately arrested and taken to court, where they were found guilty of both kidnapping and murder. When the court proceedings finished and John and Robert walked down past James's family, everyone said that they looked absolutely distraught. But one thing that everybody agreed on was that neither James nor Robert looked apologetic for what they'd done. They were sad purely because they'd got caught. Given how high profile this case was in the UK, so much investigation has gone into what could have caused John and Robert to do this. It's known that John's father had at times rented violent movies, and one idea is that John and Robert had somehow got their hands on these movies and watched them, and it had inspired them to do what they did. But there is absolutely no proof at all that Robert and John even watched these videos, and even if they did, that's a pretty big reach. After the boys were arrested, they were put into a children's home where they stayed under detention for 8 years. As I said, at the time of this case, both boys were 10 years old, so by the time they were 18 in 2001, they were actually both free again. And this is the point in the case where there is a lot of debate about how this was handled. Both boys were set free with new names and cover stories and basically a blank slate. Since their names were changed, it's hard to keep track of what actually happened to the boys. I'm sure that the police will be keeping a very close eye on them and will have all their records. But as far as the public is concerned, it's not really known what's actually become of Robert. John Venables, however, has stayed very much in frequent contact with the police, as in 2010 he was arrested for owning and distributing child pornography. Since this arrest in 2010, John has been released and arrested multiple times, and I believe he is currently on his 3rd new identity. I don't really understand the legal specifics of how these boys have been given so many chances. I guess there must just be different rules for if you're really young and commit a crime like this. I mean, it hopefully is going to be a one-off, something that doesn't happen very frequently, but it is odd that a full-grown man who would have committed this same thing would be behind bars for life. And it's honestly very scary to know that the two boys, who will now be men, who committed this crime are just out there in the world. Anyway, that is all I have for you on this case. I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, then make sure to let me know what you thought down below, and also let me know if there are any particular cases you'd like me to cover next. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.